This audio lecture will cover the Romanesque period in Europe. Now, with the Romanesque period, we're going to start with the 11th century, and at this time, Europe is divided into these small political and economic units ruled by powerful families. But by the end of the 12th century, a few very powerful and intelligent, strategically minded rulers had begun to create nation states, and Europe began to look a little bit more like the Europe that we know today. Now, life in these times was difficult. People really struggled. The main source of wealth was land and agriculture. But as powerful feudal lords would take over an agricultural region, often the poor people suffered the most. Now, the church during this time gained quite a bit of power. The bishops and the abbots, the people that had importance in the Catholic Church, they were often relatives of royalty. And so they lived as royalty. They were very wealthy. Now, there was a natural pushback against this, and some monks began to speak of reform, of a return to the monastic way of life. The two main groups that did this were the monks at Cluny and the Cistercian monks. A big part of what people did during this period was they made pilgrimages. And the main sources, the main places that they went to for their pilgrimages were Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela, which we can see these roots here. Now, the pilgrimages, they really served to help the people that were on the pilgrimages, because that would give them something to strive for, a journey in life, but it also brought wealth to the communities that they stopped at on the way. Many churches were built to support the pilgrims, and then when the pilgrims arrived, they would give alms to help support the churches. So it sort of worked out well for everybody. It gave people something to do besides suffer in life, and it gave the people who were along the way an opportunity to support the pilgrimages and to be supported themselves. The term Romanesque simply means in the style of Rome. So there was a return to classic art and architecture during this time. In fact, it was a time of great building of both secular structures, manors, towns were built up, as well as the religious buildings, the monasteries. Now, some people surmise that this was because humanity had made it through the turn of the first millennium. So they made it through the year 1000. They didn't go up in flames. So everybody got really cheerful and did a lot of building. The structures during this time began to move from wooden construction, which remained one of the main sources, but they also moved into stone construction. Often the monasteries, such as the example we see here, were built at the high points in the communities with towers to mark them as the most important structure in the community. We see this today when you drive through, say, Kansas, and you see a small town, and the tallest building in the town would be the church spire. Here we have a model of the monastery at Cluny in France. It's actually in Burgundy in France. And it was originally built to house 1,200 monks and 80 royalty. Although your textbook says 200 monks, I like this figure better, and it seems like it makes sense when you look at the size of the structure. Now, this is a really fascinating structure because it was designed by an architect named Gunzo, who was also a famous musician. And he believed that the church could be designed to replicate the musical scale. So there was this belief that there was something called the music of the spheres, and this monastery housed monks who primarily did the liturgy. They went to church all the time, and they chanted quite a bit. And the belief was that they could tune in to a music of the spheres that would actually heighten their connection to their prayer life and also be reflected actually in the architecture of this building. I find that really fascinating. So they believed that these musical relationships reflected the stability of the universe, and that the harmony of a musical psalm reflected a greater harmony, which was the music of the spheres. So this monastery was destroyed during the French Revolution, but it's a great work. Now also, the monks at Cluny, they were their own separate land. They were not ruled by the laws of the surrounding land. All of their money went to support their works and the arts. And they were dedicated to living a simplistic life. They were sort of rebelling against the great excesses by other parts of the Catholic Church at this time. Here's an example of medieval music above us. That's some chant music. And then here we have an architectural rendering of the grounds of the monastery at Cluny. I love this monastery. So here's a third picture. It's an incredible structure. Oh, and nope, I thought we might even have a fourth picture. Oh yeah, we do. There we have it. Isn't that beautiful? That's the Third Abbey Church. So they rebuilt the church a couple of times, and then it was just basically disassembled during the French Revolution because it was a sign of the excesses. Although, in fact, the monks that lived there were committed to living a rather simple life. So let's review. There was two main cultural forces at play during this time. We have the pilgrimages, which is a travel to holy places, and crusades against the expanding forces of Islam. Now these, we could talk about the crusades and the positive and negative aspects of that, but we'll just move on and talk about art. Both of these, the pilgrimages and the crusades, contributed to the exchange of artistic styles during this period, along with illustrated books. Let's take a moment to talk about the role of relics and reliquaries in this time period. Now, this is really interesting. What the people believed is that if they could be near something that had been touched by a saint, even the bones of a saint, and they could make prayers to that saint, the prayers would have more power. This particular relic is the statue of Saint Foy, Saint Faith, and it was a child who was sainted. Now what's interesting about this one is that the original skull of this child saint was stolen by a group of monks. Of course, the monks said, oh no, the saint actually asked us to do it. So they claimed to be divinely guided to steal this relic. You see, these relics had great importance because people would make pilgrimages to see the relics, and of course they would pay alms, and it would bring importance and wealth to the towns or the churches that housed them. So anyway, this child's skull was stolen, and it was taken by a group of monks, and then it was coated in this gold and emerald encrusted statue. Now if you look at the head of this statue, it looks a little odd, because it's actually a recycled Roman statue. So there we go. That's the story of this one, and I find it really interesting. So I think in this case, the history is more important than the actual artistic merit of the work itself. So let's talk for a moment about the cathedral complex at Pisa in Italy. Now this is most famous for the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which you see on the right in this picture below. Currently, this tower is leaning 13 feet, and it actually started leaning as it was being constructed. The most recent efforts at stabilizing this tower and keeping it from toppling over is to fill the base with tons and tons of lead. So it's still standing, and we'll see how long it stands. Now this whole complex was built after the people of Pisa had a decisive victory over Muslims, and they were celebrating that victory by building this complex that was dedicated to Saint Mary. Now, one of the interesting things is that this particular complex helped to stoke a controversy in the church, which was this one. It's an age-old controversy. Is it good to have embellishments? Is it good to have extra fancy art dedicated to God, or is that a distraction? And one of the famous monks, Theosophus, wrote, God delights in embellishments. And there's another quote where the guy calls these artists that are making all this fancy art like gross apes. So, it's an age-old controversy to keep it simple or to make elaborate presentations for the divine. One example that could be given in favor of this lavish expression would be the church at San Clemente in Rome, and it was finished in 1128. Now this is a detail from the mosaic in the church, and if we look closely we can see there's two stags that are drinking water, there's a tree of paradise, there's all sorts of elaborate decorations, and this is repeated throughout the church. So whether or not this is the right thing or the wrong thing for a monk to do in the Romanesque time, it's really some beautiful art that was created. And one of the striking things about this piece is the naturalistic element, the fact that nature is included in the design. One of the primary characteristics of the Romanesque style is their elaborate sculptures on the outside of their buildings. Now here we have the south portal and porch showing Christ in majesty, and this is at the Priory Church of Saint Pierre. This was built around 1115 AD. There's some details of this in your textbook, and I invite you to look closer at the beautiful sculpture that's in this south tympanum. The tympanum is the arched area in the middle, and that was the primary place that they did place sculpture during the Romanesque period. So now we're going to look at a little bit of the metalwork of the period. And this is a baptismal font of Notre Dame, à fond. What's important about this piece, and I'm not sure if you can see it in the slide, but I do invite you to look at it in the closer looks and further in your textbook, because what we see here is a move back towards realism. Now, one of the kind of touching things about this is that it was inspired by 12 oxen in Solomon's temple carrying the fonts into Jerusalem. So that's what the sort of cow-like things are on the bottom. But also, if you look at the figures, they're very believable compared to what we've seen in the past several hundred years. Also, they're placed in a landscape that is actually somewhere, so you can recognize that. And all in all, this marks a movement back towards naturalism and realism. Also, we know the artist. It was Rainier of Huy. And this is again a move back towards allowing the artist to receive credit for their work. So now we're going to take a look at some embroidery work from the time period that we're studying. This is the Bayeux embroidery, and it was designed to speak of the conquest, the Norman conquest of England, and to sort of portray it in a heroic light. Now this particular embroidery is 20 inches high and several feet long. It includes 600 figures, 700 horses, dogs, and other creatures, and over 2,000-inch high letters. Now what's fascinating here is that we also have the inclusion of Halley's Comet, which the English royalty were supposed to have seen and then cringed in fright as they saw it as a sign that William the Conqueror was to be their new leader. So here we have the story of the Norman conquest as told in embroidery, and a very important work that survives to this day. So we'll wrap up this look at the Romanesque period in art history by discussing the Abbess Hildegard of Bingen. And she is a really fascinating character who I have actually studied quite a bit, because she was a woman who had a lot of power at a time when women really didn't have that much power. I mean, yes, they did support the men. Often they ran estates, but really men had the power in the church in particular. But she was a bit of a renegade. She, in addition to being a nun, she wrote a treatise on medicine, science. She made a lot of original art, and she wrote this incredibly beautiful music, some of which we can hear today, and I believe there's some in the videos this week. She also wrote what is considered the first opera, if you can imagine that. Now, she said that she got a command from God to write down these visions that she'd had since she was 5 years old. And the result is this image and this image that follows. Now, this one is quite fascinating because she's The title of her treatise translates as Know the Ways of Light. And in this one, you can literally see the light around her head. Now, people today say that she might have had mental illness, but whatever was going on with Abbess Hildegard, she made some beautiful art. Now, this completes our lecture. Thank you for listening.